Hi, everyone. Welcome to the March 2023 OpenZFS Leadership Meeting. Looks like we have just a couple things on the agenda. Let's start out with this macOS port. Jürgen, looks like you're getting really close.
Did I just get volunteered by someone? Cool. Okay. Sure, we could talk about that. I guess we should discuss whether or not we want the macOS port in the repository. Is it a net positive for the collective good, as it were? And then after that, how do we move forward? Like either way, right? Because it's obviously non-zero effort to keep the PR updated, right? So it's it releases me either way if it says no or if it say yes. Okay, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just pulling up the pull request.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds good to me. I know you've been making a lot of, little improvements and you're making the code more abstract over the past few years to kind of prepare for this. That's all seeming good. Like, I think having you and the rest of the OS X team, contributing directly to the main OpenZFS repo will be great.
Yep. And it certainly helps when new features go in, because at the moment, whenever someone adds a new feature, I essentially have to learn the whole thing to be able to figure out what to do for the Mac side. But
yeah.
It's all good. Yeah.
Um,
It has been extremely beneficial that we redid the whole port again after FreeBSD port, because FreeBSD made it so much easier to add another port to ZFS. So I'm glad that we have done it, sort of thing, that we did the hard work and did it all again.
yeah, I see that that the first file listed in the diff is adding it to the CI stuff. So that's great, so that everybody working on OpenZFS will, at least have to make their code compile on
It
macOS.
tries to compile it at least, yeah. It can't run it because of zip or the security stuff, but
okay.
yeah, it can compile it at least, yeah.
And in terms of running it to test it, is that something that you're doing manually now, or like, what's the expectation of other developers? Like, let's say I'm developing something and I make a change and say, oh yeah, I need to make the same kind of change on Linux, FreeBSD, and OS X because it's in like the ZPL or whatever, and the code all kind of looks the same. I type in this, apply kind of sort of the same diff to all three of them. It compiles on macOS. Is that like good enough? And then if I broke something, then you'll figure it out and fix it? Or
Honestly,
what?
yeah, that is good enough, right? And then I'll have to come in and fix it. There are steps we could take. We could set up our own runner. So we disable the zip and then we can actually do the test run and so on. And that is part of the plan or the idea. I don't know. That would be part, you have to work with Brian to set that up for the actual repository. Right?
Yeah, like to run it on AWS, like the other runners that we have, right?
Yeah, it will be our own runner, so it'll be on presumably my hardware somewhere, right?
Okay.
Mac somewhere, right?
So like not cloud thing, but like a computer that's sitting in somebody's office that is kind of being invoked
Unless
by
we
the runner.
can rent a Mac in some rack somewhere, maybe you can.
Like in AWS. I think you can in AWS.
Yeah, if you can with zip off, then we should definitely do that. I currently use There, which lets me load the kernel and run the tests, but it has a 90-minute limit, so we do a smaller test run, if that makes sense.
I just put a link to the AWS docs for their Mac instances. That would kind of be a good default because we're already using AWS for the other stuff.
Yeah, we'll look into it. I think Andrew is the guy who takes care of all the runners for me, so we'll see if we can do something with it.
Yeah, so obviously we want to get Brian's feedback on kind of the idea of like the code maintenance. I don't see him here today. And then, how we could integrate it with the runners, which would, it sounds like that would be nice to have, but not a core requirement for integration. If we kind of treat it as like, maybe we call it like tier 1 versus tier 2, OS X is like tier 2. You can't break the build, but because we don't yet have CI testing for running it, it might not, tip of main might not actually work until somebody tests it out on
someone tests it
OS
and
X.
I mean, I have to make an actual installer at the end of it because it has to be code signed.
Yeah, so like at the end of a
So
release, we'd have a release. It would be like the same release number for all 3 platforms, and there might be some. I think there's already some manual steps for Linux and whatnot. So then there would be some additional manual steps for macOS.
Yeah, and if we talk about personal affairs, obviously there will be a period initially where we got to sort some things out, and I'm ready to help with that. But one concern is for me is you do all this work to add Mac OS, and then sometime like a few weeks or a few months or whatever, Apple decides to remove Keck support. Then we have to go and remove Mac OS support from the repository. That would kind of suck to have to do the work twice. So
You mean like if they make it just so that you can't do, loadable
development.
kernel modules at all?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, and then it's like, well, there is no ZFS on OS X
Right.
at all at that point. Yeah, I
Yep.
mean, that's always a risk, of course. But
Because that would kind of fall on to Brian a little bit. It's just, unfair on him, right?
I mean, I feel like it's not, we've done a pretty good job of like isolating the different platforms code. So, if we integrate it, I'm guessing, but like I'm guessing that of these, 100,000 lines of code, the vast majority of it is in new files. And not modifications to existing files, right? You've already kind of split out.
I mean, there's some modification obviously between shared files, but much less now. Yeah.
Yeah, like
and that's all in hashifdef, Mac OS or Apple.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at like there's some header files, and you've added some stuff. I mean, I feel like it's not that significant, and there's still vestiges of Illumos support in the code base, which it doesn't even compile on. So worst case scenario, if like what you're saying, Apple just says, oh, this is just not technically possible anymore, we can like remove the files and like then kind of take out dead code as we come across it, or if it hasn't changed too much, maybe you can revert the commit or whatever. Like I don't think it's a big problem for the project. I mean,
it was just a concern that I had. If it happened, it's out of my hands. Anything else, I will be willing to roll up my sleeves and help with, but Apple that would be out of my hands. Right. So
I mean, that's a risk today, right? I mean,
with
the ZFS on OS X project with the separate code base, I think from the project's point of view, the biggest risk is that like we add this support and then there aren't enough people to maintain it, so like somebody wants to integrate something and it's like it breaks Mac OS, and then you are on vacation
holiday,
or you're not available, or like there aren't enough people that care enough about OS X to go fix if it's like some big thing that's like hard to figure out. like, I don't know, encryption or like one of these other like really massive projects.
Yep.
And, somebody integrates it and thinks that it works, but then, it turns out that actually there's a bunch more work that's needed by people that are experts in OSX and maybe also in this some big new feature.
Mm.
Um, it seems like so far we've all been doing great at staying on top of that, but the developer base of ZFS on OSX is smaller than the other two platforms.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, at the moment, it's only two of us that go deep in the kernel, sort of thing. So, no, yeah, that's a possibility.
I mean, I think that said,
We
Jorgen,
haven't done much plumbing lately, though. Like the block cloning is about the only new thing in the last couple of years where we had to do a new VNOP or IOC.
Yeah. And I mean, Jorgen, you've been involved with the community for years and years and years, and we look forward to many more years.
I
so
do too.
I don't think that's a significant concern.
Okay. So, like, how do we proceed if you want to proceed, right? We used to do small PRs, right? And that was easy. But we kind of ran out of those isolated code changes. And now I made it one big thing because, we can still make small PRs if there is some area we find that it makes sense. But there now, yeah, it would be hard to pull out a small change.
Yeah. So I think that we obviously we want to get Brian's feedback. But assuming that he's kind of on the same page, the question is, to what degree are we going to code review this? Assuming that it all works, the code all kind of works, and you're happy with it, then
I will never be entirely happy with it, if that makes sense, right?
Happy enough.
Yeah, right. I mean, but it is exactly what the latest installer runs that people are running. There are a couple of small bugs that should be fixed, and there's a new version that we'll probably push out in the next week or two. That fix some Zatter problems or whatever, but that's just it. It's continuous, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I think that we should probably aim to review all the changes to existing files. Do you think how much is
maybe
that? How
remove some of the
significant?
swear words,
Yeah, if there are any, that would be nice.
Yeah.
So I think getting, maybe one code review from somebody outside of the macOS project to look at the changes to existing files. I'm just kind of glancing through them. They all look very minor so far, the ones that I've clicked on.
And the biggest change is probably in the make files and the autoconf. And I'm not confident in that area. If anyone is, take a look at it.
Yeah, I'm definitely not either.
Yeah, I'd rather not touch that.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I would say we just go for it. So I suggest ping Brian. Maybe after the meeting, I'll post the recording. You can ping him, point him at that, and we can see if he has any thoughts. What do other folks think about this proposal?
Looks like Tino's talking, but I can't hear him.
Yeah, I see that you're unmuted, but I can't hear you.
Yep. Sign language. I'm a bit rusty.
You probably had the wrong mic, just like me. Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah, I can hear.
Yeah. I was trying
Thanks
to
for the
speak
block
earlier.
cloning. I
Yeah,
got the
because
Mac stuff working, but I didn't get the Windows stuff working yet.
Yeah. So about that and the macOS port. So one way one way to approach this, like not enough maintainers for specific port, is that we could declare some ports like a tier 2, and basically they will obey different rules. So for example, if there is no response from the maintainer, I'm able to like we can merge the change, and we don't mind if it's maybe broken for a short period of time or something like this, which for FreeBSD in Linux is probably not acceptable. So it's just to ease the burden, I guess.
I mean, we could
yeah,
perhaps even make the CI run just go orange rather than red, you know, don't stop development.
yeah, I think that having kind of individual judgment by the maintainers on if we've kind of had sufficient effort to make it work on macOS, probably is a good place to start. So we kind of decide on a case-by-case basis if some change is like, well, yeah, it breaks macOS, or we change the macOS code and it compiles, but we don't really know if it works, but we'll just let it be for now until somebody comes along and checks it. But hopefully that won't be the case. I think Jorgen and Tino are super active on this stuff, so hopefully we won't run into that situation at all.
Test 1, 2, 3. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, my microphone is working. Yes, I think we should push this pull request very fast in. Just there are only some small things which are open currently. Of course, it just pulls, and it is not really releasable yet, but the things are changing within master very, very fast and very often. And it's, I think, very difficult for Jörg to understand all the changes within master. He said it in the beginning, and then put everything into his own tree. And this is really difficult for him. And of course, Windows is also a second line, which is also maintained a lot. The same thing. Maybe we should just take these two, Windows and macOS, fastly into master. No releases, but just to be on the same tree, and then the every feature will become available to all 4 Rs we then have. My English is not the best, but maybe, or I hope you can understand what I mean.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting idea of pushing both Mac and Windows at the same time and kind of clean that stuff up just once. But I can't be the one that advocates for it, I don't even know if you want Windows in there either. So is there a tier 3 thing?
Yeah, why don't we start with macOS and then kind of see how that goes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that
I hear you.
makes sense.
All right.
It will be
Other thought?
for projects. Sorry.
All right. Other thoughts on this one before we move to the next topic? All right. Hopefully that gives you a way forward. So the next thing on the agenda was IO rate limiting, Powell and Allen.
Alan, you want to start?
I don't know. You did still work.
Yeah, so I was hoping to give a short demo, but I had this brilliant idea yesterday to integrate Copilot into Vim. So it turned out I had to upgrade Vim, and to upgrade Vim, I had to upgrade FreeBSD, and now I'm not able to present because my environment is messed up. So I'm trying to get this running, but probably I won't make it. But I can show at least the some of the design choices. Maybe we can discuss them, and because it turned out to be less straightforward than I was hoping to. I will share my screen if you guys don't mind. Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay. So so there are a couple of things that we decided to do, which might be come as not optimal or not ideal for different use cases, but I will try to defend them. So first of all, we have this one rate limit property, which basically defines all the rate limiting, all types of rate limiting. Initially, we wanted to have separate properties for each type of limit, but the problem is that we have to treat those rate limiting those limits as an integral set. We cannot treat them separately. So you cannot define one limit, let's say total bandwidth on one data set, and reduce the read bandwidth on some child data set. So when you define the limits, all the limits are defined at the given data set hierarchy. So they are inherited. So if I set limits on, let's say, tank, those limits will be inherited to all the children until we find another rate limit property set on one of the children. And this property of the child is not a subset, is not a subset of the parent's limit. It's totally separate set of limits. So you can also extend the limits as well.
Yeah,
the
that was,
idea.
a bit of that was based on the discussion with Alexander Moten about avoiding the kind of recursion that we have with like quotas, where even once we're satisfied that you're under your quota for the data set, we also have to check the parent's quota and the parent's quota all the way to the root. And that is kind of slow and suboptimal. And this, we just needed it to be a bit simpler. And like Pavel was saying, the trying to mix and match these 6 quotas at different layers or levels of hierarchy was going to make it much too complicated.
Yes, especially because one operation can overlap multiple limits. So for example, if you do a data write, you want to check it against write bandwidth, total bandwidth, write ops, and total ops. So trying to figure out where this thread should wait, on which queue, at which level, and just walk the entire hierarchy and try to figure out how to do that would be extremely complex. So so this is much simpler, and I think it's still like very usable. It doesn't make it like useless. It's actually pretty usable. You define the limits on the given hierarchy, and basically everything below obeys the limits. So that's the idea. And as for performance, as long as you don't exceed the limits, of course, there is no performance degradation at all. So if you have very fast storage and you define really high limits, you won't see any performance degradation if the limits are configured or not. So the way it's implemented, it shouldn't impact performance at all. So that was like one of the goals as well. And implementing this as a single property makes it more intuitive that those are not separate properties that cannot be defined independently. You have to define all of them, or well, you can do some like you don't have to define all of them. You can define either property as none, or like you can define the whole bandwidth as none. There are some examples here. So I can define read and write bandwidth, but no total bandwidth. And I can define read operations limit and total operations limit, but no write operations limit. Or I may not define operations limit at all. So of course you can choose between them, but those limits that are not defined are not inherited from above. Those are basically, it means it's unlimited. So and coming back to discussion in one of the previous meetings, we limit operations at the file system level, at the VFS level. We don't try to go somewhere deeper and try to figure out how much actual disk I/O this operation will take. For writes, it's already too late because we are in the middle of transaction group syncing, so it's too late to do any limiting because it will just stall the syncing process. For reads, it could be possible, but then it would be inconsistent. So reads would be treated differently than writes. And at the VFS level, also it's we want to enforce the limits as soon as possible. So before we hold too much locks, some locks are fine, like range locks probably are okay because we will be holding, we will be slowing down the entire data set. So all the operations that go to the given data set, it's fine if we slow them down, but what we don't want to go into DMU or somewhere deeper and then decide that we have to sleep. So we want to enforce them as soon as possible, and we want them to be predictable. So if I can analyze my application and just check how much reads and writes I do based on the system call monitoring, I will monitor, let's say with dtrace, how much reading and writing I do. I can use that to set up like some sane limits, and then I will be able to easily verify that they are being enforced and they are properly enforced, because I can just make sure I can do a read system call at this bandwidth limit that I defined. And for operations, we will also thinking about splitting, let's say, data operations, how many reads I do, from metadata operations, let's say how many stats I do, or how many unlinks or files creation or deletion I do. But then we decided that it will basically look ugly to have all those limits in one place. Alan, you wanted to add something?
No,
Okay.
just, yeah, I think we just want to get people's feedback on these ideas because we don't want things to not be how we're going to want them.
Yeah, I think it's Joe Hesse from UCSF. I could see not being able to differentiate metadata limits from data limits as being, you know, a real place where the power of this is going to be potentially limited, right? But I guess I would ask the question in practice and what you're seeing, are there, I mean, I guess I'm just imagining there are scenarios where I really have folks who are very metadata heavy in their workloads versus data heavy, and I want to kind of compartmentalize these folks off from each other and make them good neighbors, and want to try and think about using this quota system for that. But if I'm not really correct in thinking about that, you know, because generally I try to manage things so I'm tuning the system so a lot of the metadata is coming out of cache. But if we're treating these IOPS as not being, you know, like they're not being
We're looking at it at the VFS layer
yeah,
before we know if it's cached or not.
yeah. And
Partly
so
because, you know, the idea was the cache wins are profit to the operator, not the user.
right. So
But
it
just so you know, the separation between like data operations and metadata operations are purely UI thing. So we can easily differentiate those. The changes would be pretty basic, like pretty trivial to like separate metadata limits from operation data limits. It would just make the property uglier.
Like, yeah, it's already a little ungainly if we add metadata version of all of those in both directions. That gets to be a lot of combinations.
could you do this with a metadata rate limit property that if it's not specified, then you default to the behavior that you've got right now where you're treating it all the same? But if somebody specifies that, then you would
Possibly,
use it?
although I guess it depends on the use case. Like if somebody's creating new files, that's going to use IOPS either way. And do you really want to not rate limit that, but rate limit the writes?
But so you would like to so why would you like to separate those limits? You would like to put smaller limits on data operations and higher on metadata operations?
Yeah,
How
but that's
about
just that's just based on a supposition on my part that, you know, somebody can really hammer my system with actual data rights, but somebody can also come along and really hammer it with metadata. But those numbers are going to be very different, right? The metadata quantities to really bog down the system because so much is in cache are going to be very different. Right?
So the hope was that that in this case you would simply rely on limiting the data bandwidth and just setting the operation, because from
Okay,
what I
yeah,
understand, the operation, the metadata limits would be much higher than it would satisfy the
okay,
data operations and metadata, right?
okay,
So
yeah.
you could combine those two and just limit bandwidth for data and the rest.
Okay, great. I didn't quite understand that from the presentation, but that makes sense that I would treat those conflicting neighbors by having higher IOPS limits and for the metadata heavy users, which wouldn't affect, you know, which really don't really, that's not really how I'm trying to handle the data bandwidth heavy users. And then I use that. So that makes sense. That may be sufficient. Thanks for explaining that.
Mm-hmm. So currently we also it's also possible to simply because those are not IOPS, right? So we could as easily turn the ops into just accounting for metadata operations, and simply if you want to limit data, just do the bandwidth limits. Because currently what I do for to calculate operations for data operations, the number of operations we need for specific data write or read, is basically dividing the size of the read or write into record size chunks for the given file. So this is how basically it's calculated. So
Yeah, and that's just an analog and doesn't account for indirect blocks and so on, because like we said,
yeah.
we're just looking at the VFS level.
Are you looking at doing this for zvols as well?
Yes, it's implemented for zvols as well.
Okay, cool.
Do you have a use case for that, George?
No, just curious. I was curious if that was something that was kind of in scope or not.
So the interface is let me see if I can.
This seems cool. Like I think that having it be one property, even though the inputting is a little unwieldy, like it makes sense as far as simplifying it. My question is about how the inheritance and stuff works. Like you're saying, if you can set it on a parent, and it applies to all the operations of the children. But if you set it again on one of the children, how does it apply? Does the limit on the parent still apply? Like if I do an operation on a child, is
They
it counting
don't
against
stack.
both this one and that one?
Right, they don't stack. So
They're totally independent.
So in other words, like if I set a limit on the parent, it's really what it's doing is it's saying a limit on this is what this data set and all of its descendants that do not have their own.
yeah, so like if you do
settings.
a ZFS get and look at the property, when it
Yeah,
says where it's
inher-
inherited from, that's the limit that you're being applied
Yeah,
to,
that's
and
the
it
one that's
doesn't go
being
all the way up.
charged.
So it's as the man page said there, it's different than quotas and reservations that do stack, and more
Yeah.
like something like compression. And if you override it, it doesn't matter what something higher up in the tree was set to.
Yeah, but obviously the semantics here are extremely different than compression.
Yes, but
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
it's just the first other property that sprung to mind.
That might be unexpected. Many people might expect that if you set a band limit of 100 megabytes on something, that would be a limit of 100 megabytes on the total of everything in that thing and all of its children.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. We are aware that people can expect that, and we were debating how to
It might actually be difficult to split it in some
yeah.
cases.
Would it be would it satisfy your use cases if we were to say like you cannot, like you can only set it at one level? So in other words, like once I have set this, everything below it
Yeah.
cannot have a setting. Like it uses my setting, and so like you're forcing the property settings to be like totally disjoint. That would make it more logical and not have this like weird thing where it applies to some descendants but not all of them.
Yeah, that might work. I have to check if that might mess up some of our current use cases, but
I see also like a value in being able to increase the limits for some data set deep in the hierarchy. Like I have some like database data set
Yeah.
deep somewhere, and for this specific data set, I would like to increase the limits.
Yeah, it
Then
makes sense.
in that case, you might need to rearrange your like hierarchy of data sets.
Yeah.
because I was, conceptually was thinking of it more like the encryption root property, right? It's like wherever your rate limit root is, that's where you're coming from, and anything higher up the tree, it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
As soon as we find
value.
one rate
Yeah.
limit, we stop looking
Yeah.
instead of recursing like we do for quotas.
Yeah, but I mean, that is complicated, and people's understanding of that is imperfect. And B, like with encryption, for example, if I set encryption on something, I cannot say this and everything is encrypted. Oh, unless somebody comes along and says, don't encrypt this child, right?
Well, you can do
Like
that though, right?
No, I don't think you can do that.
Pretty sure you have to do it at create time, but you can create an unencrypted data set nested underneath, or at least
Oh, really?
differently encrypted anyway.
Yeah, I mean, our root is encrypted and nothing under it is. For
Interesting.
historical reasons.
All right, well, that seems a little scary, but I guess maybe
Yeah, the
I
fact that you
can't-
can do that.
There's
not
no
anywhere.
way to get rid of
Accidentally.
it.
Yeah, and like we were saying, we could have different compression settings for descendants than you have at the root, and that's just fine, right? And I could see value of having different rate limit settings for certain descendants than others, and maybe higher or
Yeah, it's
lower than.
just the thing that's very confusing is that like I can have two peers, two children, and like this one's rate limit is set to X, and this one's rate limit is shared with all of the other peers that don't have the rate limit set,
But like if you read the property with ZFS get, it will be obvious that that's what's happening, that child 1 has a quota set of this and child 2 has a quota of inherited from this parent.
Right.
So it's not overly opaque, but I agree that it's more difficult to reason about, and the fact that it doesn't work the same way as quotas do is a little annoying, but recursively applying rate limits really made
that
it
could
seem
hurt
way
some
too
use cases.
complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that it's really complicated, but the documentation, if you can bring up the documentation again, like it looked like the first sentence of the documentation was not accurate.
I'm
or,
the author, so that's totally possible.
configures rate limit for a data set and its children, but it's not. It's like in some of its children, right? It doesn't
all of its
apply
children
to
unless you've overridden it on a child. But that's
Yeah.
the way every property in ZFS works, right?
And it's inherited children.
That wording could make
Okay.
enough of a difference, but I don't know if that's too subtle. But
there is like a specific explanation for this.
I mean,
I'm open to like modifications, of course. For me, it would be a bit of a shame to lose some flexibility only because we want to make it like a bit
easy
clearer.
to understand. Yeah.
user-proof.
Well, but there's flexibility and there's flexibility. I mean, we have a file server where I have one hierarchy for researchers and another hierarchy for systems operations. And I might reasonably want to say each of them should get 50% of the bandwidth. But that's not what happens with the current design.
Yes, being able to so it turns out being able to say how much is 50% or even 100%, right? It's extremely hard and not reliable.
Well, no, but I mean, sure.
Of course, it would be ideal. I don't disagree that it wouldn't be great if I could do that, but it has its own consequences.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we'll have to do some careful wording here. And, the fact that there is confusion is there's confusion even among experts is not a great first sign.
Right.
And we fought bravely to avoid confusion as much as possible with this design. That's why we went with one property and stuff like that. But yes, we are fully aware it's especially that you have this this experience already with quotas and reservation that works differently, right? So you have some intuition that you cannot apply here.
Like if there was something, if the way that it worked was when I set it on a child, it like consumes some of the parent's setting, then, like that would make more sense kind of hierarchically.
But what I was considering, for example, that you cannot configure higher limits than the parent, but then it would be even more intuitive to assume that it's actually shared between parent and child. And because you can set up higher, then definitely like makes you think that they cannot be shared if I can set them higher than the parent. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, another way to do it would just be to have it be non-hierarchical at all. You could say, like, there is no inheritance. You're only setting it on this particular data set. And if there's no grouping at all.
But then, like
the main use case for this is to apply limits to a container that's going to have Docker and stuff in it. And so Docker is going to create a bunch of ZFS data sets. And we want this rate limit to apply to that whole hierarchy. And so that each container can't use up
Well, one
system.
approach, of course, is limit and ref limit.
Yeah, like we also thought about, or one idea that was suggested in a previous call was having something that's more like a reservation, saying, this data set gets 200 IOPS and other data sets that, the data sets that are exceeding their quota can still do stuff as long as every data set that wants to do stuff under its quota has done it first. But that's much more complicated and out of scope for what we were trying to build here.
So
I think, like to Pavel's point, the problem with having it apply kind of recursively is we have to hang this IO off somebody and have it wait. And if 3 different rate limits technically apply to this IO, which queue does it go in? To know when, is this child has got enough write bandwidth now, but the parent doesn't? Does it end up sleeping in the wrong place or whatever?
So I'm wondering whether when we represent the properties that are inherited on children, if it was displayed as something like, rate limit root, and then the data set that is the root that is controlling that, as opposed to showing the rate limit that's inherited, then as I'm looking, and I'm presuming that what
it does
happens,
actually, like in the UI, it'll show the limit from the parent, and then right beside it, inherited from the data set.
I understand that, and that's what I'm presuming it did. But if instead of that, and I don't know if this would break code or not, but if instead of that it said inherited, and then limit root, the data set that's the limit root, then as I'm looking through and doing ZFS get, I would see, here's a limit there. Oh, and here's a child that has a limit there, and everything else would just show like, yeah, that's my limit root. And so it would be a little bit easier for me to understand that those limits aren't connected in the same way. That they're
might
independent.
make sense. Probably like if on the child the rate limit property literally just had the value inherited, and that way it didn't show the numbers again, so that they don't think it's a separate set of numbers. And I think even with that, we wouldn't necessarily even have to make a rate limit root property or anything. It would just still say inherited from, but it wouldn't reprint the number like it would currently. So each child doesn't look like it maybe reads as having a rate limit of the whole rate limit on every single child. Instead, it just says this comes from the parent, and you have to look there to see what the limits are.
So a script would have to look it up twice then, basically.
Yeah. It is.
And also, I'm not
slightly
sure
annoying,
how it applies to like those flags that I can define the source of the property, like if it's local.
right. Yes.
or
If you don't have the source column, then you wouldn't see that necessarily. Yeah.
I think it seems like that could be an improvement. Like having it basically the value of it be, see this other data set, like combined with source or something. And then you have to go look at the source, property source, to see which one it's getting charged to. That would kind of give people an extra hint that something different is going on there.
Yep.
And that would just be a small change in the properties code. It's not like we'd have to change how any of the rate limit stuff actually works to do that.
Yeah, it's just kind of how it's displayed.
Just putting a different value into the MV list that we return when getting the property. That might make it less confusing to the user.
If I might add a couple of points, I may not be able to grasp one of the technical details behind why this suggestion might or might not work. But I think the concept of the rate limiting would have been very beneficial in a multi-tenant environment, where, for example, as an administrator of some infrastructure, I'd like to delegate access to this ZFS dataset to some other entity. With the current design, I think this would not be able to work because of the intuitive way I thought about it. I think some would think about it is I would delegate, for example, this amount of read IOPS or write IOPS to this other entity or to this other administrator, and then I would just be hands off and make sure this would give the overall administrator the ease of mind that this client or this tenant won't ever be able to add more to consume more of the resources than I had originally planned for.
Right.
So
That
I think
does
my question
apply
is,
now.
does that work? Does that work with delegatable permissions or something like that?
So when you delegate a data set to a container, either a jail on FreeBSD or like an LXD container on Linux, if you're not in the global zone, to use the Solaris terminology that the macro is named after, then you're not allowed to set the rate limit property the same way you're not allowed to change a quota. So
Okay.
The root user in the container won't be able to set their own rate limits.
Okay. That makes sense.
If they're in the global zone, you'd have to ZFS allow them to change the rate limit property.
Yeah, and then I would be trusting them to set it to a same value that wouldn't break the parent. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, for the multi-tenant thing, when you delegate a data set, rate limit is protected the same as quota and reservation and like the snapshot count and a couple of the other properties that are specifically for that use case.
I don't
Okay.
I don't think that's how it worked on Illumos, at least. I think that when you delegate a data set to a zone, then you're not allowed to change the quota of the delegated data set, but you can set quotas on data sets underneath that.
Quota is kind of special because you can't set the value to bigger than the parent quota.
Yeah. So in that respect, this, like, if you think about it the same way, then this is kind of broken because, I set my rate limit, I delegate that, but then they create a child and set the rate limit of the child to something higher, thus circumventing the limit I thought I had set.
So right now, when they're not in the global zone, they can't change the rate limit
at all.
They can't set one. Yeah.
Are there other properties like that?
A couple, I think, that are constrained like that.
So the rate limit applies to the sum of everything under that?
Yeah.
No.
Or
no. That's the whole problem.
If it's inherited by each individual data set, then effectively you increase your limit every time you add a data set.
Well, no. So when it's inherited, it counts against the parents.
I see.
Quota,
Okay.
and so that's where all the waiters go to one place, and that's why it's complicated to do any kind of recursion.
Yeah. No, that's what you'd expect.
Yeah.
It's just that you can exclude certain children from that rate limit by setting another rate limit on them.
Okay.
So it's kind of, it may be unique, or at least among a small number of properties that are not allowed to be set within local zones at all, right? Yes, like here you're saying, hey, you just can't set the rate limit within a non-global zone.
Right.
But are there, I don't know that there are any other, or at least not many other properties like that.
Right. Zoned is blocked entirely, which makes sense. Quota, file system limit, and snapshot limit are you
You
have
can't set
to,
it on the.
you can't
you
set it
can't set it on
higher
those-
inside.
Yeah, I think it's like you can't set it on the delegation point, but you can set it on children of that.
Yeah, and as long as the value is less, I guess. But it's kind of implied by that one. And then
Yeah.
MLS label is also a bit special, but yeah, that is the only ones that are actually blocked in the same place there.
Yeah. So I think that kind of needing to do that is, some evidence of the funkiness of
Mhm.
the semantics here.
Would we not have a use case where we do want to rate limit within a container? Like to rate limit less than what you actually have? Like if you want to divide up.
Possibly, the issue is how. So right now, when an IO has to wait, we attach the waiter to the data set where the rate limit is. And if you have to reflect 2 or more different rate limits at different places in the hierarchy, where do you decide that IO gets added to the wait list?
I mean, I think
Which data set?
George is asking, wouldn't it be useful if,
Yeah.
and you're saying it's hard to implement,
Yeah.
So
but
Yeah,
it could
of
still be
course.
useful,
So what-
even though
what we are-
it's hard to implement.
So what we are doing now is that in like this multi-tenant environment, or if you have containers, you can rate limit the individual containers, but you cannot delegate ability to limit this further into the container, right? So this is what would be nice to have, of course, but this would still allow you to rate limit the container, but not to be able to tell the container administrator that you can limit this further and distribute the limit you got into like more granular fashion.
Yeah, that last comment has me thinking like, it's really inconsistent that you can set a higher rate limit down in a hierarchy tree, but not a lower rate limit down in a hierarchy tree. And so one of those two use cases
yeah, you can
is
set a lower
trimmed.
one. It's just it doesn't apply
Oh no, that's true.
both rate limits.
Well, yeah, okay, and it's not.
We just consider the
you can't do a
rate limit that's
subset, but-
closest to you and not
Yeah.
all of the ones up the tree like you do with a quota.
Unfortunately,
Well,
we're
it's-
coming
yeah.
to the end of our time.
Yes.
Definitely an interesting discussion. Looks like there's a couple more items that were on the agenda that we didn't get to. Volunteering some compute from Tino and 2.2 release. If folks are interested, we can continue that discussion on Slack or next time, which will be 4 weeks from now at the same time.
No problem.
Cool. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.